This conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
Ms. Erner and friends and colleagues here, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. My compliments on your beautiful church. I've not seen it before, and it's very impressive. History tells us that one of the most unstable political combinations is a country like the United States today that tries to be both a domestic democracy and a foreign imperialist. But why this is so can be a very abstract subject. I think that the best way for me to introduce this is to say a few words about my new book, Nemesis, and explain why I gave it the subtitle, The Last Days of the American Republic. Nemesis is the third of 3 books that have grown out of my research over the past 8 years. I did not set out to write a trilogy on the increasingly dangerous threats to our democracy, but as I uncovered the legacy of our imperialist pressures on many other countries and the nature and size of our military empire, one book led to the other. Professionally, I'm a specialist in the history and politics of East Asia. In the year 2000, I published a book called Blowback, The Costs and Consequences of American Empire, because my research on China, Japan, and the 2 Koreas persuaded me that our policies there would have serious future consequences. The book got good reviews, but not until after 9/11 did Blowback become a household word and my book a bestseller. In my book, I set out to explain why we are hated around the world. The concept blowback, it's a CIA term, and full disclosure is always called for. I am a former consultant to the Central Intelligence Agency. That was some time ago, but certainly at the height of the Cold War. The concept blowback does not just mean retaliation for things our government has done to and in foreign countries. It refers to retaliation for the numerous illegal operations we've carried out abroad that were kept totally secret from the American public. These operations include the clandestine overthrow of governments we do not like, training foreign militaries in the techniques of state terrorism, rigging elections in foreign countries, interfering with the economic viability of countries that seem to threaten the interests of American companies, and the torture and assassination of selected foreigners. The fact that these actions are secret means that when the retaliation comes, as it did so spectacularly on September 11th, 2001, the American public is unable to put the events in context. So they tend to support acts intended to lash out against the alleged perpetrators, thereby commonly preparing the ground for yet another cycle of blowback. After my book, and as a continuation of the analysis started there, I began doing research on the network of 737 American military bases we maintain around the world. This is according to the Pentagon's own annual inventory, the base structure report. It's unclassified, it's published annually. Regardless of the Iraq and Afghan conflicts, we now station over 500,000 U.S. troops, spies, contractors, dependents, and others on military bases located in more than 130 countries, many of them presided over by dictatorial regimes that have not given their citizens any say in the decisions to let us in. My research into our base world resulted in my second book called The Sorrows of Empire, Militarism, Secrecy, and the End of the Republic, which was published in early 2004. Sorrows of Empire was, however, written during the run-up to the Iraq invasion and didn't take into account what has happened there now over the last 4 years. Some people question whether what we do abroad as a nation can be called imperialism. The British ruled India, much of Africa, and large swaths of the Middle East through their colonies. They did not dominate these places through consent, but through direct military force. That is to say, imperialism is invariably and unalterably a form of tyranny. It never rules through consent. Similarly, the Dutch dominated Indonesia, the French Indochina and Algeria, the Japanese Korea and Taiwan. These too we recognize as empires. But what the Russians had in Eastern Europe, the system of satellites from Bulgaria to East Germany, ruled through the Soviet Red Army, was also a form of empire. Moscow dominated these countries through huge military forces stationed on their borders or based in their territories, local pro-Soviet puppets, and economic integration into the Soviet bloc system. This is the sort of empire that the United States has created and is now trying to maintain by way of its military forces and its bases, and threats such as those it issues daily against Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, the Palestinians, and other regimes we don't approve of. To do this, the President assumed powers specifically denied him by our Constitution, and Congress abdicated its responsibilities to balance the power of the executive branch. Despite the Democratic sweep in the 2006 election, it remains to be seen whether these tendencies can be reversed or controlled. Until the 2004 presidential election, ordinary citizens of the United States could at least claim that our foreign policy, including our illegal invasion of Iraq, was a work of George Bush's administration and that we had not put him in office. In 2000, Bush lost the popular vote and was appointed president thanks to the intervention of the Supreme Court in a 5-4 decision. But in November 2004, regardless of claims about voter fraud, Bush actually won the popular vote by over 3.5 million ballots, making his regime and his wars ours. Whether Americans intended it or not, we are now seen around the world as approving the torture of captives at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, at Bagram Air Base in Kabul, at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and at secret CIA prisons around the world, as well as having endorsed Bush's claim that as Commander-in-Chief in what he calls wartime, he is beyond all constraints of the Constitution or international law. We are now saddled with a rigged economy based on record-setting trade and fiscal deficits, the most secretive and intrusive American government in memory, the pursuit of preventive war as a basis for foreign policy. Bear in mind, that's what the Japanese did to us on December 7th, 1941. That's preventive war. And a potential epidemic of nuclear proliferation as other nations attempt to adjust to and defend themselves from our behavior, while our own already staggering nuclear arsenal expands toward first strike primacy, and we expend unimaginable billions on potential warfare in outer space. In Nemesis, I present historical, political, economic, and philosophical evidence of where our current behavior is likely to lead. Specifically, I believe that maintaining our empire abroad requires resources and commitments that will inevitably undercut our domestic democracy and in the end produce a military dictatorship or its civilian equivalent. The combination of huge standing armies, almost continuous wars, our growing economic dependence on the military-industrial complex, and ruinous military expenses are destroying our republican structure in favor of an imperial presidency. By republican structure, I mean, of course, the separation of powers and the elaborate checks and balances that the founders of our country wrote into the Constitution as the main bulwarks against dictatorship and tyranny. They are, in fact, the only bulwarks. We are on the brink of losing our democracy for the sake of keeping our empire. Once a nation starts down that path, the dynamics that apply to all empires come into play. Isolation, overstretch, the uniting of forces opposed to imperialism, and bankruptcy. History is instructive on this dilemma. If we choose to keep our empire, as the Roman Republic did, we will almost surely lose our democracy and grimly await the eventual blowback that imperialism generates. I cite the Roman Republic because of also its enormous influence on our own Constitution. The founders continuously referred to it. Madison, Jay, the others who wrote the Federalist Papers defending the Constitution always signed their papers Publius. Who was Publius? Publius Agricola, the first Roman consul. Americans should remember the tremendous influence of Rome on us before it descended into military dictatorship. There is an alternative, however. We could, like the British Empire after World War II, keep our democracy by giving up our empire. The British did not do a particularly brilliant job of liquidating their empire, and there were several clear cases where British imperialists defied their nation's commitment to democracy in order to keep their foreign privileges. Kenya in the 1950s and the Anglo-French-Israeli invasion of Egypt in 1956 are particularly savage examples. But the overall thrust of post-war British history is clear. The people of the British Isles chose democracy over imperialism. In a certain sense, they had no choice. They had kept the jewel in the crown of their empire, India, through military means, through administrative massacres, as they used to call them. In light of the defeat of Nazism, they couldn't conceivably continue to pursue those methods. In her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, the political philosopher Hannah Arendt writes about British imperialism, and I quote, "On the whole, it was a failure because of the dichotomy between the nation-state's legal principles and the methods needed to oppress other people permanently. This failure was neither necessary nor due to ignorance or incompetence. British imperialists knew very well that administrative massacres could keep India in bondage, but they also knew that public opinion at home would not stand for such measures. Imperialism could have been a success if the nation-state had been willing to pay the price, to commit suicide and transform itself into a tyranny. It is one of the glories of Europe, and especially of Great Britain, that she preferred to liquidate the empire." I agree with this judgment when one looks today at the Blair government's unnecessary and futile support of Bush's invasion of Iraq. One can only conclude that it was an atavistic response, a British longing to relive the glories and cruelties of their past. The American attempt to combine domestic democracy with tyranny over foreigners is hopelessly contradictory and hypocritical. A country can be democratic or it can be imperialistic, but it cannot be both. The American political system failed to prevent this combination from developing, and that I believe it is by now probably incapable of correcting it. The evidence strongly suggests that the legislative and judicial branches of our government have become so servile in the presence of the Imperial Presidency that they've largely lost the ability to respond in a principled and independent manner. Could the people themselves restore constitutional government? That's what's required. A grassroots movement to abolish the CIA, break the hold of the military-industrial complex, and establish public financing of elections is at least theoretically conceivable. We have done it before in things like the civil rights movement, the movement for reform after the robber barons in the progressive movement. But given the conglomerate control of our mass media and the difficulties of mobilizing our large and diverse population, it seems unlikely. It is possible that at some future moment the U.S. military could actually take over the government and declare a dictatorship, though they undoubtedly would find a gentler, more user-friendly name for it. That is, after all, how the Roman Republic ended, by being turned over to a populist general, Julius Caesar, who after his assassination was succeeded by his grandnephew, Octavian, who then proclaimed himself dictator for life and named himself the first emperor, the god Augustus Caesar. I think it unlikely that the American military will go that route. but one cannot ignore the fact that professional military officers played a considerable role in getting rid of their civilian overlord, Donald Rumsfeld, and that his replacement comes from the super-secretive CIA and hence is likely to be malleable to their wishes. It is worth recalling that General Tommy Franks, commandant on the assault on Baghdad, has already said in print that in case of another 9/11, he sees no alternative but for the military to assume command of the United States government. I also am aware that there is within the high command today a group of officers that have threatened a mutiny in case of an attack on Iran. I basically applaud that, but I also have to say the day that occurs, the Constitution's a dead letter. That is, it just is over. You might as well throw it away. We're in an entirely different world. Meanwhile, the all-volunteer Army has become an ever more separate institution in our society, its profile less and less like that of the general populace. Nevertheless, the officer corps might well worry about how the American people would react to a move toward open military dictatorship. Moreover, prosecutions of low-level military torturers from Abu Ghraib prison and killers of civilians in Iraq have demonstrated to enlisted ranks that obedience to illegal orders can result in their being punished, whereas officers go free. No one knows whether ordinary American soldiers would obey clearly illegal orders to oust an elected government, or whether the officer corps has sufficient confidence to issue such orders. The present system already offers the military high command so much in funds, prestige, and future employment via the military-industrial revolving door that a perilous transition to anything like direct military rule would make little sense under reasonably normal conditions. So my guess, and it's a guess, is that the United States will maintain a facade of constitutional government and drift along until financial bankruptcy overtakes it. My wife is forever saying to me, "Come up with something optimistic, would you?" And I said to her, "I've got it. It's bankruptcy." I mean, that's better than the alternatives. Of course, bankruptcy will not mean the literal end of the United States any more than it did for Germany in 1923, China in 1948, though, of course, Germany in 1923 led directly to the rise of the Nazi Party, China in 1948 to the victory of the Chinese Communist Party, or Argentina in 2001 and 2. It might, in fact, open the way for an unprecedented restoration of the American system, or for military rule, revolution, or simply for some new development we cannot yet imagine. Certainly, such a bankruptcy would mean a drastic lowering of our standard of living, a loss of control over international affairs, a process of adjusting to the rise of other powers, including China and India, and a further discrediting of the notion that the United States is somehow exceptional compared to other nations. We will have to learn what it means to be a far poorer nation and the attitudes and manners that go with it. As Anatole Levin, author of America, Right or Wrong, An Anatomy of American Nationalism, his recent book, concludes, and I quote, "U.S. global power, as presently conceived by the overwhelming majority of the U.S. establishment, is unsustainable. The empire can no longer raise enough taxes or soldiers, it is increasingly indebted, and key vassal states are no longer reliable. The result is that the empire can no longer pay for enough of the professional troops it needs to fulfill its self-assumed imperial tasks." On February 5th of this year, the Bush administration submitted to Congress a $481.4 billion defense appropriation budget for fiscal 2008, plus a request for an additional $245 billion to pay for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. This brings just our official defense spending to about $750 billion. It's a number hard to imagine. $1 trillion is 1,000 billion. It's quite a bit larger than the official Cold War defense budgets. At the same time, the deficit in the U.S.'s current account, that is, the imbalance in the trading of goods and services, as well as the shortfall in all other cross-border payments from interest income and rents to dividends and profits on direct investments, this underwent its fastest ever quarterly deterioration. For 2005, the current account deficit was an unbelievable $805 billion, 6.4% of national income. Those of you who remember Econ 100A from your university days will recall someone like me saying to you that whenever the current account deficit is up to, say, 3%, the country is a basket case. Well, ours is at 6.5%. The U.S. trade deficit, the largest component of the current account deficit, soared to an all-time high of $725.8 billion, the fourth consecutive year that American trade deficits set records. The trade deficit with China alone rose to $201.6 billion, the highest imbalance ever recorded with any country. Meanwhile, since mid-2000, the country has lost nearly 3 million manufacturing jobs. To try to cope with these imbalances, in March of last year, Congress raised the national debt limit from $8.2 trillion, again, the number, you have to see it sometimes to see the zeros that go out after past that, $8.2 trillion to $8.96 trillion. This was the fourth time since George W. Bush took office that it had to be raised. The national debt is the total amount owed by the government and should not be confused with the federal budget deficit, the annual amount by which federal spending exceeds revenue. Had Congress not raised the debt limit, the U.S. government would not have been able to borrow more money and would have had to default on its massive debts. The point is, of course, we live by borrowing. We live by putting it on the tab. Among the creditors that finance this unprecedented sum, the two largest are the central banks of China and Japan, both of which are the managers of the huge trade surpluses these countries enjoy with the United States. This helps explain why our huge debt burden has not yet triggered what standard economic theory would dictate: a steep decline in the value of the U.S. dollar, followed by a severe contraction of the American economy because we could no longer afford the foreign goods we like so much. So far, both the Chinese and Japanese governments continue to be willing to be paid in dollars in order to sustain American purchases of their exports. For the sake of their own domestic employment, both countries lend huge amounts to the American Treasury, but there is no guarantee how long they will want or be able to do so. As Herbert Stein, once the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in a Republican administration, rather famously said, "Things that can't go on forever don't." And that's pretty much where we are right now. Marshall Auerbach, an international financial strategist whom I admire, says we have become a Blanche Dubois economy, named after the leading character in Tennessee Williams' famous play, A Streetcar Named Desire. She was, as you remember, heavily dependent on the kindness of strangers. Unfortunately, in our case, as in Blanche's, there are not many strangers left willing to support our illusions. So I believe and hope that our imperialist venture will end not with a nuclear bang, but a financial whimper. It seems to me unlikely that a president or Congress from either party will manage to dismantle the military-industrial complex, end the secrecy and the black budgets that make public oversight of what our government does impossible. 40% of the defense budget is secret. No one ever gets to see it except uniformed military officers and 2 or 3 select members of Congress. The CIA's budget, of course, has always been secret from the moment it was created. Everything about it is secret. And bring the president's secret army, the CIA, under democratic control. I therefore conclude that Nemesis, in Greek mythology, the goddess of vengeance, the punisher of hubris and arrogance, is already present in our country, simply biding her time before she makes her presence known. Thank you very much. I'd be glad to try and respond to comments and questions.
America is today the strongest, the most influential, and most productive nation in the world. Understandably proud of this preeminence, we yet realize that America's leadership and prestige depend not merely upon our unmatched material progress, riches, and military strength, but on how we use our power in the interests of world peace and human betterment.